The humidity in Hong Kong on September 8, 1972 was a physical weight, the kind that settles into the bones of the city. At the Hong Kong Grand Hotel, perched atop Victoria Peak, the air conditioning in the Grand Conference Room was struggling against the heat of 73 bodies and the incandescent glow of television lights. In the center of this room sat two men who in the summer of 1972 were more than mere athletes. They were the twin sons of the global physical consciousness. Muhammad Ali, 30 years old, was the king of the world, a man whose banishment from boxing for his political convictions had only served to turn him into a secular saint of the counterculture. Bruce Lee, 31, was the little dragon, a man who was systematically dismantling the mysticism of traditional martial arts and replacing it with a cold, hard science of human combat. They had never met. They were never supposed to meet. The events that followed, the brief, violent 4 seconds of a friendly arm wrestling match, would become a case study in sports medicine, a nightmare for international relations, and a haunting reminder of the limits of the human machine. The meeting was orchestrated by Chen Wei-ming, a television producer with a flair for the theatrical and a dangerous misunderstanding of the men he was dealing with. Chen saw the meeting as a simple East meets West promotional opportunity. Ali was in town for a 3-day tour for a sporting goods manufacturer. Lee was blocks away filming the final sequences of Way of the Dragon. Chen's original memo to the hotel staff described the event as a congenial exchange of pleasantries. There was no mention of a contest, there was no mention of a stopwatch, there was only the hubris of a promoter who believed that if you put 2 apex predators in a room, they would simply pose for the cameras and purr. To understand why the injury occurred, one must first analyze the physical state of the 2 participants as they sat at that mahogany table. Ali stood 6'3" and weighed 210 pounds. His physique was the result of a very specific kind of evolution. A boxer's strength is longitudinal. It is built for the delivery of force through the knuckles, transmitted via the arm to the shoulder and down through the core to the feet. His right forearm was 14 inches in circumference, a mass of dense, slow-twitch muscle fiber designed to absorb the recoil of a punch and the impact of a 200-pound opponent's chin. However, Ali's strength was not rotational. Like most boxers of the era, his training avoided heavy weightlifting or isometric wrist work, as the prevailing wisdom suggested it would slow the hands. His joints were conditioned for compression, not torque. Bruce Lee stood 5'7" and weighed 135 pounds. While he was nearly 80 pounds lighter than Ali, his density was anomalous. Bruce Lee's training was decades ahead of its time, focusing on functional tension and the development of the forearm and grip. Lee's forearms were disproportionately large for his frame, a result of his obsession with finger power and wrist-winding exercises. More importantly, Lee viewed the human body as a series of levers. In his private notes, Lee often wrote about the 3 points of failure: the wrist, the elbow, and the shoulder. He believed that a smaller man could defeat a larger one not by matching force, but by applying force to a joint at an angle the joint was never designed to resist. As they sat down, Ali was looking at a little man he could easily overpower. Lee was looking at a series of mechanical hinges, one of which, Ali's right wrist, was already positioned in a way that Lee knew was structurally vulnerable. The atmosphere in the room shifted when an unidentified journalist shouted, "Why don't you arm wrestle? Let's see strength versus technique." The room erupted. In the 1970s, arm wrestling was the ultimate barroom metric of masculinity. It was visual, it was easy to understand, and it required no equipment. For the media, it was the perfect photo op. Ali, ever the showman, leaned into his persona. "I'll go easy on you, little dragon," he joked. For Ali, this was theater. He had arm wrestled fans, sparring partners, and celebrities his entire life. He had never lost. He assumed his sheer mass would act as an immovable object. However, Lee was visibly uncomfortable. Witnesses, including his student Wong, noted that Lee's eyes darted towards the cameras and then towards Ali's hand. Lee understood the social trap. If he refused, he lost face in his home city of Hong Kong. If he participated and lost, he proved that martial arts were inferior to boxing. But if he participated and used his full technical knowledge, he knew the risk of injury was catastrophic. The social pressure mentioned in Lee's later apology cannot be understated. In the hyper-masculine world of 1970s combat sports, a no was not an option. Lee sat down. He gripped Ali's hand. The stopwatch clicked. What occurred between the go command and the sound of the fracture is a sequence of events that sports kinesiologists still study today. As the match began, Ali applied what is known as linear resistance. He held his arm steady, using his bicep and shoulder to create a wall. He was smiling at the photographers, waiting for Lee to exhaust himself trying to push the heavy arm down. Lee did not push. Instead, he did something Ali had never experienced in a test of strength. He engaged in pronated rotation. Using the muscles of his forearm, the pronator teres and pronator quadratus, Lee began to turn Ali's palm towards the table, while simultaneously pulling Ali's wrist towards himself. By the second, Ali's smile vanished. He felt his wrist being forced into ulnar deviation, a position where the thumb side of the hand is pushed away from the forearm. This is a position of extreme structural weakness. Ali's reaction was instinctual. He countered with more force. However, because his wrist was already out of alignment, Ali's own muscle power was now being directed against his own bone structure. He was, in essence, using his 210 pounds to crush his own wrist against the immovable grip of Lee's technique. Lee transitioned into a technique derived from Wing Chun, known as Lap Sao, grabbing hand. He wasn't just holding Ali's hand, he was using his fingers to pin Ali's metacarpals, the hand bones, together. This prevented Ali from opening his hand to dissipate the pressure. At this moment, the force traveling through Ali's wrist exceeded the yield point of human bone. In engineering terms, Ali's radius was the loaded beam, and Lee's grip was the fulcrum. The sound was described by South China Morning Post reporter David Lim as the sound of a dry branch snapping in a winter forest. The scaphoid bone, a small cashew-shaped bone in the wrist, shattered under the compressive force. This was followed instantly by a hairline spiral fracture of the distal radius. The torque had quite literally twisted the bone until it splintered. The stopwatch stopped at 4.2 seconds. Ali's scream was the only sound in the room. The immediate aftermath was a masterclass in chaos. While the cameras continued to flash, Ali collapsed back into his chair, his right arm cradled against his chest. Bruce Lee stood frozen, his face a mask of what witnesses described as pure clinical horror. Ali was rushed to Hong Kong Central Hospital. The attending physician, Dr. Robert Chen, would later describe the X-rays as disturbing. The injury was a comminuted scaphoid fracture. Because the scaphoid has a notorious lack of blood supply, this is one of the most dangerous bones to break for an athlete. If it didn't heal correctly, Ali would lose the ability to snap his jab, the very weapon that made him the greatest. And furthermore, the hairline fracture in his radius meant his entire forearm was structurally compromised. Ali underwent a 2-hour procedure to stabilize the wrist. Doctors debated inserting a permanent pin, but Angelo Dundee, Ali's legendary trainer, argued against it, fearing it would vibrate during impact and cause further internal damage. Instead, they opted for high compression cast and a grueling 6-month rehabilitation schedule. By the morning of September 9th, the story had bypassed the sports pages and landed on the front pages of the New York Times, the London Times, and Le Monde. In the United States, the reaction was of fury. American sports writers, many of whom harbored a bias against martial arts, characterized the event as a cheap shot or an ambush. There were calls for Lee to be banned from entering the U.S., and rumors circulated that the Ali camp was preparing a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the Hong Kong Grand Hotel and Bruce Lee personally. In Hong Kong, the narrative was the opposite. Local tabloids hailed Lee as the giant slayer. The incident became a symbol of post-colonial defiance. To the people of Hong Kong, Lee hadn't just broken a boxer's wrist, he had proven that the Eastern science of the body was superior to Western bulk. Lee was horrified by this narrative. He spent the next 48 hours in seclusion, eventually emerging to give a statement that remains a landmark in the history of sportsmanship. The statements released by both men in the wake of the incident saved their reputations and arguably prevented a permanent rift between the boxing and martial arts communities. Lee's statement was not the defensive posture of a movie star. It was the technical confession of a scientist. I have spent my life studying the application of force. My greatest failure on September 8th was not a failure of technique, but a failure of character. I allowed the noise of the room to silence the knowledge in my mind. I knew the wrist was at its limit. I should have let go. I offer my deepest apologies to Muhammad Ali, a man I admire more than words can express. Ali, speaking from his hospital bed with his arm in a heavy plaster cast, showed the grace that defined his later years. Despite being in significant pain and facing the possible end of his career, he refused to blame